Thank you very much, Professor Finizio, for the invitation, the repeated invitation. And hello, everyone. Thank you also, Chiara, for the great organization and help. I love coming to Torino, in particular right now. I'm happy not to be in the US, believe me. Yeah, I've been already teaching also in the 2022. I've been teaching some of the master students here with a little module on transatlantic relations, but that was 2022 in the good old years of the Biden administration, right? So I don't even know, to be honest, where to start with here. Also, just a little bit about FIU. FIU, Florida International University, is we have 60,000 students. It's a top 50 public research university. We're the highest research classification in Carnegie. Check it out in case you are interested in going on beyond the master or getting a second master in international relations, right? Of course, we focus a lot on Latin American politics, but also have strength in Europe, including the Jean Monnet Center that I direct. So, that being said, let's get to the topic. Again, sort of where to start, right? I was working this morning to update it. I don't know how much you follow, so what I want to do now in the next 45 minutes to an hour, before we get into question and answers and the discussion, I want to present you with a little bit of information sort of about where we are right now, in case you have not been up all night, and then sort of focus on sort of the question of what does this mean for transatlantic relations, right? Also, just a little bit about myself, which you forgot to mention, but don't worry. I'm actually German-born, right? So I'm double citizen, so I kind of have sort of these two souls, although, as I just expressed earlier over lunch, my American soul is increasingly drying out or dying out, I don't know. I'm still a little bit in shock what happened. So, okay, let's get to the elections themselves, right? A little bit about the update and a little bit about sort of how this whole thing works in case you don't know, because it seems can be a little bit different from what we are used to in Europe. First, as a matter of context, yes. So first, as a matter of context, in many 2024 elections that we've seen around the globe, as well as in Europe, we've seen a shift towards change. Yes. Yeah. Don't worry, I'm not touching it. We've seen a shift towards change, right? That means, change away from incumbent parties to new parties. They often were populist, nationalist parties, but not always. I'm just mentioning here as examples what we've seen in the previous months, right? The elections in the UK, which remember, however, changed from conservative to, from conservative to social democrat, Labour. In France, we saw, right, the really difficult elections there, and Macron basically losing his majority and being now considered sort of a lame duck president, right? And the strengthening of the far right and Le Pen and Bardella there. And we've seen this also in Austria, right, where the far right made quite a big, increasing voter electoral success, and in Germany, where also the far right in state elections has strengthened significantly and now pressures even the central government in Berlin. Okay, so in the run-up to the U.S. elections, there was already this kind of feeling, something ominous. We may see a change because remember, Kamala Harris was representing a certain type of continuity from the Biden administration of the last 4 years, right? So you could have reasonably imagined that Donald Trump as sort of representing on the one side something new than Biden, but also a little bit of continuity in the sense that people knew what happened when he was president for years, that he may have had good chances. But let me tell you, and of course I've read a lot of analysis over the last couple of months, nobody, even the best political analysis in the US, expected the outcome that we've seen tonight. Okay? Now, in short, here I speculate a little bit, who are the winners and who are technically the losers. The winners is nationalists, populists everywhere, right? And I should congratulate Italy, because Italy under Giorgia Meloni will, you will see, will have a much better and bigger standing in the European Union and in Europe in the coming 4 years, okay? Not only because she has similar party affiliations than Trump, but also because she's, for example, pretty much best buddies with Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk, a major player in the new administration. Viktor Orban of Hungary, another sort of nationalist with semi-authoritarian governance, by all means. And he also basically said that he would open bottles of champagne if Trump wins. And he, among other things, right, held even back or tried to hold back the latest Ukraine tranche of aid to Ukraine, saying he wants to wait till after the elections in the US. The losers, by most means, the European Union as such, right? Because we've seen this during the first Trump administration, and we will probably see this in the next 4 years, that the European Union will come under much more pressure than under the Biden administration. The LIO, as I write here, which is short for Liberal International Order, and that is really something very important to note, okay? We may have grown up here with cherishing and expecting that the West, or Europe and the US, the Transatlantic Order, that they can sort of be the guardians and the representatives of some kind of semblance of liberal internationalism, but this election will change the course of history tremendously. It will have repercussions after the 4 next years, for sure. And of course, on the losing side, likely will also be Ukraine, because as you know, Ukraine is a drawn-out protracted war. There was a lot of pressure on Zelensky and the government, even under the Biden administration, and now the Europeans will ask to do it themselves in terms of support. And Donald Trump himself basically said, right, that in 24 hours after taking office, I will basically end the war in Ukraine, probably allegedly making a Russian-friendly peace negotiated deal with Vladimir Putin. Okay. So, how did we get there in terms of how it worked? In the US, it's a little bit different. If you think about it, let me just go here to the next one. I'm going to come back to the first one. Just if you take a look at, this is the electoral map of this morning, the states of the US, and the red ones, obviously, as you can see, are where the Republicans have won, including in Florida. The blue ones are where the Democrats have won. Okay. First impressions, anyone? Is there something happening on this map? Do you see any connections? Please don't be shy. Yes, please.
Maybe the fact that the coastal states are mainly blue, Democratic, and the fact that the central states are Republican?
Yes, exactly. That's basically the general sort of clustering that is happening. Of course, not all the coastal states, right? If you look here at the southern, southeastern states, right? Those are, including Florida, they have become staunchly Republican. We were once a purple state, being a swing state, but we have become, of course, a hotbed of Republicanism. Yes, anyone else who wants to add on to it, please?
Most swing states have gone right.
Yes, swing states have also gone right. And here, this is sort of the graphic from the New York Times that I put up here for you, right? Basically, we have, in order to win the presidency, it's not about the popular vote in the US, okay? It's also not by determination of the Congress, right? Whereby you invest prime minister or president. No, you have to have 270 electoral votes by 270 electors that are from the various states. And there, that swing state, these are important because swing states, as the name says, can go either way. And here you have the 7 swing states, right? Wisconsin, Nevada, Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, the biggest prize of them all, and North Carolina and Georgia. Some of them you were able to already glean in the weeks leading up to the elections that they may go one way or another, but overall, the swing states have almost exclusively, right? And particularly Pennsylvania was the biggest disappointment. When Pennsylvania was hot for Donald Trump, he was basically crowned president this morning. Yes, please. There was one more, and then we'll Yes. Exactly. The big urban areas tend to be more Democrat, right? Whereas the rural areas, including the heartland, as we call it, right, have become even more staunchly Republican. Exactly. So definitely there is this clustering going on, and so it's kind of important to keep this in mind because this is also that part of separation and polarization, spatial polarization, is also an increasing problem that we would see and that will be there for the political system in the future. Okay, so the votes are decisive in these 7 swing states that didn't hold up as projected, right, in last night. And so Donald Trump at this point is the president-elect and will then take office in January 6th when these electoral votes are officially certified. Remember, that's why we had the January 6, 2021 revolt against the Capitol, right? And they were trying to stop the certification of the votes for Joe Biden. Okay, so what does this mean? It means also that the outcome does not only shape transatlantic relations, or TAR, right? So TAR used for transatlantic relations. It also influences, of course, not only the bilateral relation between Europe and the US, it also shapes sort of the US's foreign policy in terms of how isolationist it will be. And we can get talking about that a little bit in more detail, right? Because on the one hand, the US wants to be the global leader, right? We've seen this, wants to play world police. Those are called the primacists in the Trump administration, or previously in the Biden administration, but then you have also the isolationists, the ones who said, you know what, we are overstretched already with our means, right? We have fought wars that were not in our interest, so let's concentrate on our country again, right? You know, take jobs back, right? And keep immigrants out, yada, yada, all of this. So it does not only shape the outcomes, the global engagement of the US and the transatlantic relations, but of course also we have to think about this, the domestic US institutions that are there, right? And so if you think about Congress, the bicameral house, right? The House of Representatives, by the way, as anyone, I haven't checked the last 2 hours, but the Senate, the US Senate, the upper house is already in Republican control, 51 to 41 this morning. Do you have any updates about the House of Representatives? It's probably not called yet, because they're still counting some of the votes. But if you can... Yeah, then probably it will remain Republican. It is still Republican, right? But I think the House hasn't formalized sort of the voting yet. They're still counting last votes, but yeah, that's pretty obvious, right? That this will be. So that means it's not only a president, Republican president. We can maybe discuss later the meaning of republicanism, right? Because in effect we have now a Trump wing, the MAGA Republicans, and remember we had the good old Republicans, okay? And they don't like each other, of course, either. So, but this is also momentous because it means we don't only have a president who gets political opposition in the Congress. No, you have Congress being Republican, the presidency being Republican, and the last institution, the Supreme Court, with a 6-3 conservative majority Republican as well. That will allow Donald Trump to go much further than he did before. Plus, give me a second, he has that's his last term as a president, right? So there's no pressure for him to appear even moderate to become re-elected. And he doesn't really care. I mean, I think we all know this about the Republican Party as such, right? It's a vehicle for him, for his personalistic leadership. Okay, no problem. Okay, thanks. Yeah, we'll do, again, we have half an hour question and answers, right? So please keep questions and comments for later, unless they're really important or you don't understand anything. Good. And so this means, also domestically, the US is in for a larger shock than ever before. Even though we know Donald Trump, right? This will have long-lasting consequences, particularly with the Supreme Court, where judges are basically appointed for a lifetime, way beyond the next 4 years, okay? He may well be able to add 1 or 2 more judges of the Supreme Court, and then forget it, right? Then there is no checks and balances that we know of. How did he do this? And by the way, I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going into the policy differences, unless we can maybe refer that later, but I think you kind of know where some of the major differences are. This is sort of incomplete sort of domestic policy agenda that shows you differences between the Trump administration and the proposed Harris administration that will not be realized. So how did he do this? Well, of course, it's a complex picture, as you can imagine. But one was he made really inroads among the Latino population in the US, okay? The Latino population, just like the African American or Haitian Americans in Florida, we have a large contingent of Haitian Americans as well. They were considered, because they are racial minorities in general, socioeconomic minorities, they were considered to be fairly firm in the Democrats' hands, so to say, right? The Democrats took them for granted, and many of these contingencies did say, not anymore. Plus, think about this, many Latinos that moved to the US, became citizens in the process, came from leftist socialist regimes. Venezuela, right? Colombia sometimes at times. Ecuador, Bolivia, right? Latin America is in that sense also highly polarized, so many of them fled that leftist regimes. Of course, I live in Miami. The Trump administration has been honestly much better than the Biden or Harris administration in sort of infiltrating and working with Hispanic-speaking media outlets, right? Kind of scaring them. I mean, called Biden the communist, which is far from the truth. But if you come from a country, right, in which you have actual communist regimes, then that is a good scare tactic. So, wins amongst Latinos. Over 20% more Latinos voted for Trump than in 2016 now. About 47% of Latinos in the US, I think, now voted for Trump. African American, but also men in general, right? So we've seen also a little bit of the gender balance. That was, of course, particularly highlighted after the invalidation to the Supreme Court of existing protections towards abortion, the Roe versus Wade decision, right, that was invalidated last year. So Harris, as you may know, has run on that platform, right? It's a women's decision to do with their body what she wants. Yeah, lots of women did vote for her, maybe not too many, right? Abortion is a contested issue, even amongst women. And the US in general is much less secular as a society and is more conservative in many ways than many European nations. So men, he really made inroads in the white male vote. They also suffer from deindustrialization. That blue wall states, the swing states in the Northeast, that didn't turn out for Harris. There was a lot of disenchanted working, blue-collar, working-class members who lost their jobs to outsourcing over the last year. You know what that means in Italy and in Europe. African-American men, another sort of, you would think, a fairly safe choice for Harris. No, African-American men, particularly the way that machoistic campaign was led by Donald Trump, also got an increased support from African-American men, and you heard a lot what you heard from them was sort of, you know what, we don't want to be taken for granted by the Democrats. Democrats have not done enough for us for our socioeconomics. The economy, inflation, and immigration were two major big points, and of course, disinformation. And by the way, disinformation as well as misinformation. Disinformation in the sense that there was state-sponsored, external, right, engagement on particular social media by the likes of Russia, by the likes of Iran, by the likes of China. I don't have to say too much about that. And then remember, misinformation. The domestic recirculation of those messages, unwittingly sometimes, of course sometimes on purpose, by young people, by older people that use social media who don't have the necessary digital literacy to really test the validity of these posts. All of this together explains kind of like what I would call the landslide win of Donald Trump. Because again, nobody, even political analysts in the US expected that success. Winning the popular vote by 5 million, right, that's just something that was not seen as being possible. Okay, We went over this already. Well, this is just a little bit to give you some impression, right? So where does it leave our transatlantic relations? Okay, here, let's start out with this first one here, right? Times Magazine, Europe, America's New Rival. This is not a Trump era cover, but guess from when that is? 1973, okay? After the end of gold standard, you know, when the Europeans were starting to do things themselves, right? So it's that Europe could become a competitive rival is kind of an old thought and really has never gone away in Washington. And it has only increased as Europeans have unified and solidified the European Union. And then, I'm not, does it say hunting the white man? Right? This is exactly it. I don't know much about the game, so I don't want to go into it, but I wanted to insert sort of an Italian characterization of, you know, Harris's appeal.
This is not Italian, it is the right wing.
The right wing, sorry, right, the right wing is good. And then this of course means that you can see here, right, that my question or my hypothesis, working hypothesis overall, which I have published too, is that the Atlantic has gotten wider after the end of the Cold War and has only increased after Trump. And of course now basically that bridge has been burned and will probably crash anytime. And in case you read the Foreign Policy magazine, right, one of the top journals in the field, check this out. This was, I think, the last, or the one before the last edition. Europe alone, 10 major thinkers on the future of Europe without an American embrace, right? So really a kind of depressing wake-up call for Europe by political economists. Also a little bit, just to give you a little more update, what did the youth people vote, the young people vote on? What was the youth vote, right, 18 to 34 on? Because I thought it may be interesting for you, given that you probably, most of you are in the same age range. If you can, these were the main things that concerned them when they were voting, and you can see here the highest point was the cost of living and inflation, okay? You are probably all familiar with this because we even went through worse inflation here than in the US, but the US's recovery was not quick enough, you know, to have made a difference. Jobs that pay a living wage, you can see this here too. And then these kind of what we would maybe call vogue topics, social justice topics, they really, if you can see here, they came secondary. And that also explains why young people have voted in higher numbers for Trump than as expected for Harris. So to go back to Bill Clinton's word of the 90s, it was the economy stupid, right? That's the last slide sort of about the current elections. What was the most important issue? And this from the New York Times, September 4th newsletter. And you can see here, you have the swing voters here. They could go both ways, the independents as we call them, the Harris loyalists and the Trump-leaning folks. And while inflation crisis is basically the top issue for most, you can see here the differences among the Harris-leaning folks, where climate environment, abortion, civil rights, right, these social justice concerns seem to be more predominant. Whereas on the Republican or MAGA-leaning folks, inflation and immigration are primary concerns, right? And this is obviously, these points are where the Harris campaign didn't seem to be able to deliver. So, a couple questions that I hopefully be able to answer that we can discuss in the next whatever hour or so. To what degree is the EU now recognized, or was, but also is, recognized as a significant, important, but also autonomous actor? So that it is important, the EU, but it also that it is separate from the national capitals in Europe. Okay? Because the US had always the tendency, no matter if it's a democratic administration or a Republican administration, to rather, they preferred bilateral continent, right? Divide and conquer tactic, if you want to simplify, right? They rather talk to the presidents of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, you name it, rather than to Brussels. Many, even US leaders from George W. Bush to Trump, didn't know what the EU was or actively discredited the European Union. If you followed the first Trump administration, you know what I mean, right? The Trump administration literally called the EU a foe and a competitor, and actively work towards just destroying it, and will continue to do so in the next 40 years. So that's the US's strive towards bilateralism. Of course, we also have to take into account the European side. And this is where, for example, Riddervold and Marianne Riddervold and Akademie Newsom, they had a quite interesting journal, special issue coming out about transatlantic relations, where they said, yes, one thing, of course, is the behavior of the dominant US administration towards Europe, but we also cannot forget it depends also on the degree of EU unity, right? If the Americans are able to basically dictate to the Europeans, or if the Europeans are able to have an independent, strong response to American pressures. Okay, so the degree of EU unity. Now, I don't know about you, but as somebody who's been following the EU politics for 2 decades or more, I'm not so convinced that we have a high degree of EU unity right now, right? And the win by Donald Trump will embolden exactly the people who want to basically see more national power, less Europe. How are these perceptions of transatlantic relations? Because in transatlantic relations, as in any international relations or diplomacy, right, perceptions are important, they do count, particularly in the media age that we live. So how are these perceptions or transatlantic relations changing with the different leaders? So has the Atlantic gotten wider with after Trump? I'll give you some data in a second. Biden, remember, was also called by many analysts the last transatlantic president. Right? And by the way, even if Harris would have won, he would still have been, by the way, the last transatlantic president. What does it mean? The last old school transatlanticist. Because if you think about the history of transatlantic relations, why were they so close? It was because of the Cold War, right? It was, and this is what I said in my writings too, it was a artificial straitjacket, right? That transatlantic relations. So after the end of the transatlantic relations started already to become questions, not in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, not in 2003 when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, but in 1991 when the Cold War ended. NATO back then was already declared dead. Okay? Are these enduring US differences, are they causing a real, lasting split in transatlantic relations? My hypothesis is yes, they will. And in stuff that I published in 2019, in the Routledge Handbook for Critical European Studies, I exactly point to some of these differences in EU-US differences in leadership. I'll get to that in a second. So they both have leadership ambitions, EU and US, but different types. Different socioeconomic models. Guess what? Question, what do you think? How many legally paid vacation days does the US provide? Did I hear the right answer? 0. Okay? 0 legal holidays. You know how much we do get, right? We complain about 5 or 6 weeks. So, they're very different socioeconomic models, right? Obamacare, or the universal health care is something that we are used to, we expect from governments. Trump said he will definitely, whatever has been sort of implemented, he will make sure this will not get implemented. And I'm already horrified of Robert Kennedy as the new, health minister in charge, right? Vaccine denier and so on and so on. It's going to be really fun. So there are these differences. There's of course disagreement over European integration. Remember, the US administrations, they were in the beginning of the EU, post-World War II, they were of course interested in the European Union. They supported, with the Marshall Plan, the establishment of the European Union. Why? Because it was largely in the interest of the US, okay? And that has not changed. But what has changed? Now that the Europeans strive for more strategic autonomy, right? Become a potential geo-economic competitor, the utility of Europe for the US has gone down. And then you just need a nationalist or isolationist such as Trump in office, and you know where this is going. And of course, multipolar world order. Again, this was something that, by the way, the US set up, the Bretton Woods institutions, right? The European Union. This was all the post-war liberal consensus that created that liberal international order that then Trump started to disassemble, put pressure on in the first presidency, together with the rise of the BRICS countries, that sort of post-colonial resistance movement from the global south, right, that created now the perfect storm, where we literally see a fundamental shift in geopolitical history, right from your eyes. And that's what's meant, of course, by the last question as well. Now, what's the official story? Just very quickly, of course, you know, the Europeans are very interested, by the Europeans I mean the Brussels, right, and most, you know, transatlanticist governments, right? They're of course interested in keeping the relationship alive. So what they've done, and you know what, I work a lot with the EU delegation, the EU's embassy in Washington, together, right? So over and over again we hear the same story, which you probably have heard here on the podium as well as in your professional careers. We have, and that's true, we do have the world's most important trade relationship, not with China, neither the US-China nor EU-China, right? It is the EU and US that have the most important trade and finance relations in the world. Also in terms of not only trade, not only capital, also in terms of foreign direct investment, although China is trying to get their hands on there. In terms of the jobs, I mean, there are about, you see it in the graphic down here, there are 15 million jobs in the US are dependent on or done by European companies. So, think about this for a second. If Trump implements those damaging tariffs, right, and European companies are hurt, in a fallback cycle, it will also hurt specific states where the European companies are located. Right? Then we have transatlantic dialogue. Transatlantic dialogue has always been important. It has been upheld at least since the end of the Cold War. We have regular executive meetings, right, on the presidential or prime ministerial or commission president level or commissioner level. We have the transatlantic legislator dialogue. For example, in Washington, we don't only have the EU delegation as the EU's embassy, but we also have the European Parliament liaison office. In case you are interested in that job, they also have traineeships, right, offered. And of course, increasingly the role of experts. The Biden administration implemented not only the TTC, or you may have heard about this, the Trade and Technology Council, where every 6 months, both sides of the Atlantic meet to consult about particular technology companies and its impact on the economy. But also we have now a Security and Defense Council. I'm not sure, however, how often that will meet. That's only been created under the Biden administration 2 years ago. Well, global partners, yes, technically we are, and probably NATO is sort of the biggest, linking element between the US and most of us Europeans, right? Because the multilateral avenue through the United Nations is already kind of damaged. You know that over the years, I don't know what you think about the UN, but the UN is basically sort of becoming less and less legitimate, right? As the reform is being stalled of the P5, the permanent members, and as it is shown not to be instrumental in solving the major conflicts, such as the Gaza-Israeli war, right, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO, however, used to be the more strongly institutionally connecting element between both sides of the Atlantic, but you probably are also familiar or aware that there has been a lot of pressure from not only Donald Trump. It was already for 20 years the Americans have asked the Europeans to pay more in terms of their expenditures on defense, the 2%, the magic 2%. Right now they're talking about 3% or above. And yeah, the Trump administration had the effect that now increasingly the European partners are upping their expenditures to 2% or above. And let me do here, I don't really like to predict, but I bet you we will see many of them now in the interest of good collaboration increase their expenditures to beyond 2%. And so shared values, well, democracy, but I mean, to be very honest, I have a hard time right now today to talk about the US as a democracy, and you all know, no matter where you're from, I think democracy, no country really has a perfect democracy. There's an ideal type. We always can strive towards a better democracy, but honestly, what I've seen over the last 20 plus years in the US has been slow, democratic regression, and we had some of this here in Europe as well. Human rights, yeah, forget about this with the Trump administration, right? It's all against this woke business, as they call it. And of course, inequality, I mentioned that separately because here I refer on about economic inequality, okay? And this is something that is also important, the fact that the US, just like Europe, has less of a competitiveness problem, if you remember the whole Draghi report discussion, right? But they are also under fire from, as a high-wage country that has a few good sectors of the economy, such as AI, right, and cyber, and anything related to high tech. But again, the Rust Belt states, they're called Rust Belt for a reason. Okay? Large deindustrialized swaths. So the US has a very unequal economic system, again, similarly concentrated to the coast, the big urban areas, right, that profit more than the heartland. And just to sort of go a little bit more granular onto sort of like the public opinion polls, aside from the official governmental stances, the US's view of the EU, of course, varies by difference, of course, between the elites and the public, right? And I'll show you in a second some graphs that illustrate that, but also by education. And as somebody who is a professor in the US, I can't just tell you, it's not very, even at higher education level, it's not, there are top institutions in the world, but overall the US educational system leaves much to be desired compared to European countries. And of course the left-right spectrum, right, that has become increasingly polarized. We have this in Italy, we have this almost everywhere in the US. To show you here some illustrations, okay? While overall the European Union may have a fairly stable support of around 50%, this is a little bit outdated, right? But you can see over 20 years nothing changed, 53%, right? That means half, the glass is half empty, half full, that is, in 2004, 77% of Europeans know little or nothing about the EU, okay? They may know now, 20 years, more about the EU, but that doesn't make them more supportive of the EU, particularly if they get fed a lot from the top down. To go back to illustrate the polarization, this shows you here the view of the EU by party affiliation. Look what has happened here. You can see particularly over the last 10 years, 2014 and following, right, the last years of Obama, Trump, Biden, that there has been extreme polarization in the sense particular degrees by Republican-leaning adherence has tremendously gone down. Okay? And this is sort of, you can see here how that then the EU easily becomes more contested in this highly polarized public opinion. And by the way, here, just to give the counterexample on top here, I showed you the a poll that I saw this morning. A median of 4 and 10 across 34 countries say the US used to be a good example of democracy, but is not anymore. Right? 40% say it hasn't been in recent years. 21% say it is still a good example. Again, this was the end of Biden administration. And 22, the same amount has said was never a good example. What are some of the other explanatory factors aside from the leadership? And by the way, here I wanted just to put you up this graph here that shows the varying confidence among Western European publics of the various presidents. And you can see here it's like a roller coaster, where of course the general tendency still holds true, right? That Republican governments or administrations are not trusted in general by the Europeans, but Democratic ones tend to be much more, right? Although the Harris administration would probably not have gotten such high ratings, because the Harris administration also would have expected much more of Europe than even the Biden administration. So, in terms of geopolitics and threats multipolarity question, right? So some of these transitory factors are, of course, the EU's fear of the so-called Asia pivot. You remember the pivot to Asia that Obama already implemented, right? Or started to implement? That was just continued. I mean, the fact is that this is the Asian century that we're living in. This is also a multipolar century that we're living in. So a power, the West ruled in the 20th century, but the West simply does not rule. The West, including the US and Europe, does not rule the 21st century. And there the Europeans in particular fear, or still fear, the US is increasing attention towards the Indo-Pacific, right? Relocation of troops, relocation of trade policies, and so on and so on. US neo-isolationism, I talked about this quickly already, so I don't want to spend too much time to it, right? Remember, there's this tendency in the US between these two beating hearts, but definitely the Trump administration and Trump himself could be, even Trump compared to J.D. Vance, the vice president, has much more isolationist policies in mind, right? Focusing on protecting the US rather than trying to exert more international policies to play the world's police. And if you think about it, in this era of danger and crisis that we live in, the US tends to have more country-specific threats. Iran, North Korea, Cuba, China, whereas the EU overall, even focusing on the 2016 EU growth strategy and so on, has more issue-related threats. Climate change, terrorism, right? Public health. There's also, you can see these differences. The competitive leadership. I spent a few minutes, you know that with the rise of the EU's economic and political power, of course, it became, again, less instrumental for the US. A clear factor is, of course, also the rise of US big tech. So the US is the leader in the big tech companies that you all are familiar with, right? Whereas the EU is the leader in regulating them. And basically, you're putting regulations and rules on those. That already caused tension and will, of course, continue to do so in the next years. I kind of, in my publications, said in terms of the leadership that the US excels in a sort of nationalistic, religious exceptionalism. Right? The US sees itself as the exceptional country, the best democracy in the world, right? The city on a shining hill. You probably heard these expressions before, which is an expression of sort of a nationalist, but also religious exceptionalism that the US has. The EU, I stipulate, has a similar type of exceptionalism, but it's not as pronounced, and we focus more on this sort of secular, and it's more Pacific. It used to be Pacific, right? Normative power, civilian power. Of course, these have gone out of the window at least since 2022 with the Ukraine invasion. But there are certainly, even if you look at the NATO discussion, you see that the Europeans have a hard time suddenly transforming into a military power with all the talk that comes out of the capitals in the process. Different norms. There are, of course, different norms. Again, we have the difference. The US is a neoliberal country electing, think about it, a business billionaire precisely to be the 900-pound gorilla in the political porcelain shop. That's why he was elected. So what you will see is much more in the next years, and we've seen this over the first Trump period. The transactional, instrumental trade policies. What is there for the US? What is in there for the US? There is little concern for international laws, little concerns for international stability question, right? Because of the kind of neoliberalism. Sovereignty. The US, again, is of course a very sovereignty-minded country and doesn't understand a lot of folks that don't understand the idea that the Europeans would cede sovereignty in the European integration process, right? So we have here fundamental understanding. Weapons. You know there's the school shootings, right? There's more school shootings per year than there are days in the year in the US. Getting pretty tired of it myself. And so the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, become even more so. The US still has the death penalty on the books, right? You know that the EU has a moratorium against the death penalty, you see some differences. Populism, well, populism is actually a political ideology that increasingly unites us. Because ironically, right? It is so. And multilateralism, obviously, we have very different positions on that. So, and there are many of the case studies where the collaboration didn't really institutionalize so well. TTIP, if you remember the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that was supposed to be the world's largest free trade agreement between Europe, the European Union, and the US. The Obama administration didn't get to finalize that, and now it's been all eyes are dead for the last 10 years. The tech giants, we just talked about this. Climate, right? Forget about the Paris Agreement. China. China is of common concerns, but as you know, there are differences between the Europeans and the US in how we relate towards the China challenge, right? For a number of reasons that we can debate maybe in a few minutes. De-risking, right, versus decoupling that the Americans want. And so what we see now that if the US drives a harder course, particularly economic tariffs and sanctions against China, this will, of course, also indirectly negatively affect the European economies. NATO. All that's off. I don't know if you want to make it. I'm not sure about the future of NATO. But again, NATO has been pronounced so many times that it will probably survive. So overall, there's an EU. The EU is more process-oriented, right? Which you're probably aware of, whereas the US is much more unilateral, action-oriented, right? Fighting the war and then asking the questions afterwards. So, what does this mean? And by that I finish up here. Some kind of competitive cooperation in a more geopolitical world. Well, Trump obviously was no 4-year mistake. He's here to stay. And it is really an expression of deeper ideological commitments in the political culture of the US. Right? So it's not an aberration, but it is something very American with long-lasting effects, particularly if you think about these effects on the political institutions. What does this mean for us? Well, it will mean likely a structural rift in transatlantic relations, right? Those relations, they literally are on life support, I would like to say. And so now it depends what the Europeans, what we can basically offer to the Trump administration to find the best way forward in the next 4 years. And after that, we really don't know if there will ever be an election in the US. I mean, I guess they should be all better off. It could also mean a bitter medicine, as some have called it, for the EU. You know, we knew that a Trump administration, second Trump administration was a possibility, right? Europe has called for Trump-proofing policies, but there was a lot of talk as usual and not that much action. This may actually lead European governments to bulk up their defense measures, to create more support for European integration, which also happened during the first administration, and to also economically find, for example, a more common stance against the challenges posed by China, which we've seen there's no common sense in that, right? If you just look at sort of the votes over the tariffs of the EU against Chinese EV electronic vehicles. Again, he's the last term president, so he doesn't have to be re-elected with the control of political institutions. The EU is therefore viewed as a competitor and a Pacific multilateralist, and of course that contrasts with this much more transactional, business-like approach that he has. That means, among other reasons, we have on the one side this polarization on both sides. So only the far right in the EU will now will be happy about this win and will have better relations over the next 4 years, but good luck, Ursula von der Leyen, right? This misinformation will not be reined in if you have Elon Musk being a consultant for Donald Trump, or maybe you have an official role in his cabinet, okay, with this major platform business, and his Starlink, right, internet, satellite projects, and multi-billion-dollar contracts through NASA. And of course we have the leadership issues not only in the US, also in the EU, right? Think about it. That Franco-German tandem is basically broken. Macron is the lame duck president. Now I'm much more sort of, I can see Marie Le Pen elected, much more so than before, after tonight, last night. You know what's happening here in Italy with Meloni. The German government is the German government coalition is about to break apart. Right? There will be much more pressure on them now. So not all is well in that sense. You know, there should be a vacuum here too. But again, maybe we need a bitter medicine to kind of unify Europe. That would be at least probably a typical Brussels answer, right? We grow through crises. And so if transatlantic relations are at all desired and to remain strong, both sides need to solve their internal crises. And the EU needs to definitely ramp up their defense spending, need to improve the burden sharing, will have to take on the responsibility for some kind of settlement in Ukraine. And the EU is also well advised, of course, to diversify the partners, right? That means, of course, maybe getting in a closer relationship with the United Kingdom again. I'm not talking here about getting back into the EU, right? That's unlikely happening. But you know, we have with Keir Starmer's Labour government a fairly EU-friendly government in the UK, and so we need to kind of have a rapprochement there, and maybe looking towards other trade agreements. The EU and Latin American Mercosur agreement is one that's on the books that we have basically ready, but now we need to work on getting it finalized if possible. India is one of the biggest countries, right?
Yeah, no, I mean,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. Yeah, no chance. Yeah. Let's see, but you're yeah, he's going to be 2 years old. So there are other, right, the fence-sitting countries, you know, Indonesia, India, Brazil, right? There's a whole more regional powers in this new multipolar system that are not Russia, that are not China, that are not the US, and that the Europeans probably need to kind of try to create a balance of power. Okay, well, this is just for own enjoyment, right? So this is hypothetical. But I leave it at that because it's 3:15, right? And so we have then half an hour for. So thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions, comments, and let's get a little bit of discussion or some sort of interesting exchange. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Markus, and the mic is ready to fly everywhere. Here, yes. So close.
Can you hear? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. Hi. My name is Anna. I'm from Romania.
Hey, Anna.
I'm actually not a political science or international relations student, but I'm interested in this topic. So here goes my question. A rather more theoretical one than practical. But I was wondering whether a connection can be derived between the two-party system and the result of this particular election. And I was wondering whether you could illustrate this through some examples regarding the present, maybe polls on the matter, or I don't know, just some illustrative examples in this area.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, there has been some debate, right? You're totally right. Obviously, the two-party system that the US has is a problem, right? And so we have seen attempts. There have been third-party candidates already for long. But I voted, because I'm double citizen, right? German and US. But first, I made sure I vote. I would not have come here, right? If I didn't vote it. And so if there were, for president, there were about 5 candidates on the ballot, right? So there are third-party candidates, and there have been third-party candidates, already starting with Ross Perot in the early 2000s. So these third-party candidates, as we call them, right? Now you may have heard about Jill Stein. She's the Green Party candidate who probably got most of the votes, and then maybe Robert Kennedy, the guy that now probably become Secretary of Health. So they don't get many votes, right? They get maybe about 1% of the vote, but in a fairly competitive, polarized elections where it is so close, if you look at the state results, right? Overall, that Trump won 5 million more votes out of whatever, 200 votes. That seems a lot, but it isn't that much. In most states, on the state levels, particular swing states, the results as of this morning, they were 51% for Trump, 49 or 48 for Harris. So a 2-3% difference. Then, in a state, that has a third-party candidate like Jill Stein, those even tens of thousands of votes going to her and not going to the Democrats, to Harris, cost Harris that state, and if it's a swing state, resultingly cost her the election. Right? And that argument has been made to Jill Stein very much so. But just to give you these examples, of course, here the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had also sort of some deleterious effects, because the Harris administration was seen as basically being too pro-Israel, notwithstanding that Donald Trump has a much closer relationship with Netanyahu than Harris has, right? But the Biden administration's ineffectiveness in achieving a peace agreement in the current conflict has led many Arab Americans to vote for Jill Stein or even for Trump. Okay, and that simply, in such a tight contest, that's a problem. Now, there's of course, that is a longer-term problem, right? The two-party system, and we've seen there will be probably that debate will increase now over the next coming years, particularly since the Republicans are split, right? We have in effect 2 Republican parties, but so basically the MAGA party, the Make America Great Again, Trump wing, and we have the good old Lincoln Republicans, as we call them, okay? But the party structure, the party system, has been taken over by Trumpians. Right? Trump's daughter-in-law, she's the secretary of the Republican Party. That tells you, right, something. The Speaker of the House, Johnson, right, is a Make America Great Again loyalist. That means even within the Republicans, right, there may be some attempts to kind of push for a multi-party system, but a multi-party system means a constitutional revision process that is so difficult to achieve, right? I think 3/4 of all states, right, plus a super majority in Congress would have to agree to that, and that's, we had the electoral college system has been around since the founding of the United States, so it's unlikely that you can implement a multi-party system. I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
John, yes. No, there is this one.
Hi, thank you for your exposition. I would like to know your opinion about the...
Introduce.
Okay. I'm Celeste, from Argentina, Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero, Buenos Aires. I would like to ask you your opinion about Latinos, especially from Cuba and Venezuela, that migrates to better democracies and vote for anti-democratic candidates. In Argentina we have lived that situation with Venezuela, people from Venezuela that voted or supported an anti-democratic candidate that nowadays is our president.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great to have you here. Latin America. Yes, of course. Living in Florida, right? We have some of the highest Latino populations, but again, one thing is in the U.S., right? Even more so, I think, than in Argentina, the Latino population is very diverse, right? It is not a unitary bloc, but in the past, again, they were taken for granted as a solid democratic constituency, right? That they would vote Democrat. But we have very different New Mexican Americans, which are the largest contingent, which are more on the West Coast, of course, or in the South, Texas, New Mexico. They have very different concerns. And nowadays, many of Mexican Americans, but also longer immigrants, not only the more recent ones that fled political crisis, but the longer ones. Hispanic Americans have been around before the founding of the United States, 250 years ago, right? So they consider themselves, of course, as Americans, and they also don't see eye to eye with the newly arrival migrants, okay? A lot of them, if you look at the Latino polling, they voted for Trump also because of the immigration measures. They support the implementation of the Trump wall, right? Because there may be some part of, because they feel American and not necessarily in that sense Latino or Latino American, right? We use that. And B, they may not also don't want to share in the wealth with the rest of the Western Hemisphere, right? Which is a sort of classic nationalist ideology. So Latinos are much more diverse, and I think in that sense the Trump administration, the Republican machinery has had much better time, and I've seen this, in Miami and in Florida, to go into the Hispanic-speaking media, and they were able to address Latino voters in a way that the Biden administration has just not done. And when they did it, it was way too late to do so, right? That's just one of the examples. Now with the newly incoming ones, first newly incoming ones, we have to also distinguish, right? They first have to attain citizenship in order to vote, right? So there's this part. But again, they don't see it as voting for an anti-democratic government, right? Because remember what I said earlier, they see Biden and the Democrats as communists. So they see the Democrats as anti-democratic. And think that, it sounds silly, but if you come from a country with lots of political stability problems, and you come to the US and somebody promises you to make America great, or great again, you can fall for that logic. It is at least a vision that is slightly more ambitious, right? And as you know, these migrants come to America to make something of themselves, right? So this is a more aspirational logic that's more appealing than a Biden, it will get better, right? We muddle through a new way forward. And if you looked at Harris, she was a good candidate, but she was not a perfect candidate, right? She oftentimes, when she was asked about the details, what she could do for example, racial minorities and ethnic minorities, she didn't have necessarily the answers that they wanted to hear. Trump had the oversimplified answers, but he put them out there. So that's as best I can answer.
Yes, okay, sorry.
And
Yeah, my name is Vedant and I'm from India. I think in contrast with modern history, and I consider this decade is one of the wonderful geopolitical era, and also a lot of things going on around the world, conflict, geopolitical turmoils, and also the power shift between a great hegemony of America and towards the rising power of China, and also some other countries, developing nations like India, and they are rising with the support of some organizations forming, like getting stronger, like BRICS. So I wanted to know, in terms of international relations and geopolitical aspects, about the future expectations, because this year has been very interesting and drastical for the elections in Russia, in India, and USA now. So we are having elections in this year and new parties are coming. So what are the geopolitical expectations for next 5 years?
I'm here talking about more thank you. Good question. The geopolitical expectations. In general, I would say you will see a historic, and I don't say it lightly when I say historic, a historical, epochal change in the history of international relations, okay? I may be a little bit of a pessimist, and I don't want to, but everybody agrees that this, again, will have, it's not just a Trump mistake. This will cement what we've seen already gradually building up, right? This sort of multipolarization, more geopolitical, geoeconomically competitive multipolar system in AR that will definitely occur in. And this just cements what happened yesterday, it just cements that. And then now how is Trump dealing with this? Well, as you can imagine, I don't know, exactly his relationships with the Indian Prime Minister, but with many across the world, right, from Xi Jinping to Vladimir Putin to Netanyahu to Erdogan, he has fairly good relationships, right? He's a classical sort of strongman who prefers, Viktor Orban, right, who prefers the company of other strongmen, plus the fact that he is fairly unpredictable for a politician, because he's not a career politician, makes them a little bit more careful. Okay? Of course, you always say in politics, political leaders prefer stability, so in many ways, but if you look at some of the readings from these geopolitical powers, they said they could work, or they could see themselves working with both of them, okay? And that wasn't because they wanted to be diplomatic and guard themselves no matter the outcome, but because they knew with Harris, we know what we're kind of getting. We're getting stability, and basically it's a Biden continuation of Biden to a certain extent. But with Trump, we knew what happened 2016 to 2020, and we can work with this guy as well. Okay, so I would definitely that trend towards more geoeconomics. The US will become more isolationist. That's sort of what I would project, and a much more geo-competitive international system, that's for sure. Right? Again, I don't want to be a pessimist, but a classic liberal international order that we've seen is, good luck with that, that's a life support. I'm not sure it will ever come back. Sorry to be David Dahmer.
Hi, I'm Koya, I'm from Romania. I also don't study political science.
What do you study?
Law.
A law, yeah.
All of us study law. I actually was wondering about your opinion on two issues, if that's okay. Okay, first, you were talking about the old school Republicans, the old Republican Party, and so on. And I was wondering, considering Trump's outright victory in this election, and even with some old school Republicans endorsing Harris or refusing to endorse Trump, do you think that there is a chance for this old Republican Party to come back, or do you think that's dead?
Yeah, okay. I would definitely gravitate towards saying that's that, right? I mean, over 250 top Republicans who worked with Trump in the first Trump period, right, came publicly out against him. 250 of the top echelons of the leadership. So, of course, Trump also has the problem now, who can he put into office? Because those 250 are out, right? So he has to find new people. Which, of course, the likes of Robert Kennedy or Elon Musk. That should be interesting. They will not... This is a very good question, because all these Republicans counted, with Harris in a more, less partisan and more bipartisan government. That's obviously not possible. So this goes back to your question as well, right? Watch what happens in the next 4 years. I can't really say what's happening, but the Liz Cheney type, the Lincoln Republicans, they're definitely on the defense, and they have no power in the party structure, not much power in terms of party financing. Because many of them supported the Harris campaign. Right? I'm not sure what's going to happen. They're going to be on their way out, and again, with unknown consequences about the party system.
And the second question.
Okay, thank you. And I also wanted to ask you, I would say especially as a slightly concerned Eastern European about Ukraine, do you think that Trump is actually going to force a peace deal and give a part of Ukraine to Russia, or do you think that he will simply abandon it and let it defend it and Europe defend itself?
Yeah, I mean, remember he said that he would find a settlement very quickly. Right? So in January 7th, we can expect a settlement, just like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I mean, he will definitely rely on the Europeans to take much more charge. That depends on how much of the threat he implements in curtailing NATO, right? He was against NATO. I mean, the US Congress had to pass a law 2 years ago saying that a US president cannot leave NATO because they were so afraid, right? A Republican senator, Marco Rubio, brought that up, right? They were so afraid that he would unilaterally withdraw from NATO that they passed a law saying the president cannot do that, okay? So that, NATO will probably continue to exist. I would kind of hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah, exactly. But Zelensky knows that he has to agree to a settlement deal. And by the way, if you look at some of the many European, even European Union politicians, they were also of that opinion, right, that this projected war in effect is already a frozen conflict, and we just didn't want to sort of, officially say it. Now, Trump's official position gives a lot of European policymakers also a leeway to kind of say, yeah, okay, you know what, we support an agreement, right? But yeah, I wouldn't want to be Zelensky at this moment, right?
Hi, my name is Paula. I'm from Argentina too. I want to ask if there are consensus in the European Union to go in search of regulated markets like Latin America, and if it is through the Mercosur agreement or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, if it's, trade related, it would have to be through the EU-Mercosur agreement, remember? Because trade is in the competence of Brussels, the trade commissioner, right? And the EU, since the EU has legal competence over trade, it would have to be channeled through, bilateral EU-Mercosur relations. So that's, I think, what the Europeans have tried to work on for a long time. Again, I think France is one of the big, resistances, but given that there will be elections in 2027 in France, and Macron is already considered a non-effective president at this point, there will be much more effort on getting it ratified and implemented.
Hi, hello. My name is Nino. I'm from the University of Belgrade. Let's just say that the atmosphere in Belgrade is similar to the one in Budapest.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can see that.
But my question is that...
Congratulations, I suppose.
During the first Trump administration, we saw certain political institutions, including the military, being resilient. Checks and balances, or trying to maneuver around him. So today, last night, with the domination of the Republican Party, are those institutions capable of once again being more resilient, or maybe stopping some policies, or maneuvering around? And the second question, I guess, is will the democracy in the US, those political institutions, will they start to erode even faster?
Yeah, I think the second answer is easy. The second question is easy to answer. Yes, right. They will definitely erode faster, and that is just the problem. That's I think the question that's a little bit harder to answer regarding the second question. Will they erode to a point of no return? Right. So what does this mean? At one point, can we call the U.S. not anymore a democracy? The chances for it have increased now that all the major political institutions are Republican, and that allows Trump to get much further. But also, I honestly do not think that he will implement a 60% tariff on Chinese products, because a 60% tariff on Chinese products by the US would lead to a world recession, and that means also a US recession, so he doesn't want that either, right, for a number of reasons. With regards to the first question, the military had some leeway, but there wasn't, I think, all that much in terms of independence of the military. They were basically able to keep him away from the nuclear button, right? We're at this basic level now, By the way, right, some of his folks called Harris, oh, don't vote for Harris because she would be like a monkey with a nuclear button, right? And this is the level of offense that was slung around during the campaign. Nowadays, I think because given that the Congress is also a Republican, there would be anyone who would be trying to resist would get the wrath of the whole administration, not only Trump, right? In the past, he was much more constrained. Again, now there are many constraints. He doesn't have as many constraints as last time, and he literally said he will go after the people. I think there will be actually political repression and recrimination, right? So here, going back to your second question, I'm literally listening. I'm now looking for a job and also in Europe. That's it's not fun anymore. So sorry. Good. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Maria Pia from the University of Turin, and I was wondering if do you think that the late timing of Kamala Harris' campaign and also the nomination of Kamala Harris as presidential candidate would have changed, affected her campaign, and also if her campaign would have started earlier, the results would have changed, or if just Donald Trump was unreachable.
Yeah. No, honestly, I mean, this is a little bit more sort of personal, informed opinion, but I don't think the late entry has changed anything, right? Because think about it. If she would have been a candidate from the start, the American public would have much more time to get to know her and her policies, right? She wasn't, again, the best campaigner or debater in terms of the specificity of her politics and the sort of feel-good campaign, right? She ran, remember, initially, there was a lot of, and you can see this in the polls, there was a lot of enthusiasm for her, right? Oh, yeah, because she's not Biden, right? A younger, fresher voice, but this feel-good new way forward, right? Of course she had some policies, and she is smart. But she was not able to pinpoint the details and the concrete benefits for the average Americans, particularly when it comes to immigration and the economy. And so, would she have been longer campaigning, people would have found out more about some of these shortcomings, right? And then I think the result probably would have been similar.
Hello, I'm George, I'm from Greece. I would like to ask you regarding the tariffs that President Trump has suggested. How feasible is it to impose 10-20% tariffs in essentially all products that arrive to your country? Because obviously the United States cannot produce anything, and if you are going to do something like that, as the European Union said, you are going to have tariffs on your own products, so you will receive less, probably of materials that you don't necessarily produce, but you won't also have the exports that you used to have. How financially feasible is this? Do you think like it will happen, or it was like an excuse or like another lie?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm not a political economist, right, so I want to say that. But he can impose the tariffs, particularly when you have a Congress, right, that's also, of his party. So that allows him very quickly to do that. He cannot withdraw from NATO as easy as he can impose those tariffs, okay? Again, he said Europeans can expect 10 to 20%, right? Chinese can expect 60%. I honestly don't think in reality that he will impose that, again, because, like you said, the 60% tariffs in China would lead to retaliatory tariffs from China, would lead to extreme trade war, would impact European companies that produce in the US, would of course also raise the prices for US consumers, right? And all of these follow-on effects. But there has been an argument made definitely to use them as a pressure tool, right? So to continue to threaten and to implement lower tariffs in order to get whatever his administration wants out of the relationships with China, for example. It will also, remember, a higher tariffs on China would mean that China would redirect their export to Europe, and then we would have to deal, right, with more trade dumping here in Europe, pulling European economies down that are not doing so great anyway, as you know. And there was one more point that I wanted to make. I mean, a lot of the US economy, right? Of course it is trade-based, but a lot of US trade, including manufacturing, is already outsourced to countries like Mexico as well. Plus, the Silicon Valley, which is a major contributor, the tech giants, the big ones that you all use and know, right? They are not affected by the tariffs. Okay? So in that sense, it would be easier for him to implement sort of limited tariffs without major damage to the economy, I would say. So we are much more, right, susceptible to the tariffs. And I think out of US, China, and us, I think we are the ones probably most under pressure. But that's my, non-political economy opinion.
Hi, thanks for the speech. And my name is Feng Junpeng from China. My question is, in fact, I'm very curious about that. Do you think that maybe Trump takes charge in the White House is totally a disaster on the perspective of the United state interest. Because from a Chinese opinion that we see Donald Trump as a relatively dramatic person or a political leader, yes. But either Republican Donald Trump or the Democrats Harris, either both of them, they do something, they do some strategies or some like the infrastructure investments and job acts, they do that strategies at the same way, or maybe their ways are different, but their aims or their maybe they are somehow somewhat similar. So I wonder that do you think Trump's way for America on the perspective of state interest, not maybe he hurts the democracy of the he hurts the U.S. democracy, yes. But at the perspective of the state interest, do you think maybe he is the right way for America? Yes, I'm very curious about this.
Yeah, that's a good provocative question, right? And I mean, this is also part of the platform that he used to campaign, right? I am the billionaire businessman, not a career politician, right? So I kind of know how to make money. I know what's good for American businesses, right? This was effectively the platform that he was campaigning with. Now, will he be able to implement that? I am honestly just looking at the first 4 years of his term, right? 2016 to 2020. I don't think he was all that successful, right? It is in effect very difficult, to create high-pay manufacturing jobs in the global north, right? We struggle here with as well in Europe, in many countries. And so the US struggles with that too. So I don't know how he thinks, but again, I'm not an economist, right? How he thinks that, we can bring all these jobs back, and he wasn't able to demonstrate that. So I think if he is able to improve sort of he won't improve an American economy that is, in that sense, sustainable or socially, evenly distributed. It will lead to many more very rich millionaires and billionaires. Remember, corporate tax cuts, right? Tax cuts for high-income earners, right? That's also part of his business. It will lead to many more very rich people, so the overall GDP may look good, but the Rust Belt states will still have to deal with the industrialization, right? So I don't understand why these manufacturer folks voted in such large numbers for him. But again, it's not only sort of his empty promise. There's also disinformation. There's also disappointment over the way the Biden administration has handled deindustrialization and so on, right? So in that sense, yeah, Silicon Valley may be doing well. Big CEOs, his friends, they will be capitalists, will be doing well. Ordinary workers will not be doing well. And I don't know, my sense of the economy doing well is that most people should be doing well in the economy, right? I hope that answers your question. Yeah, I mean, technically, what you see, and I'm sure the data comes out if you look at the data itself, the electoral data. Exactly. A lot of manufacturing votes went for him, and a lot of the really rich vote that expects went for him, right? But that's sort of the educated, upper level income segment. They're predominantly or overwhelmingly or majoritarily voted for Harris, right? So what we've seen is also exact the democratic shift. I mean, the labor in the US was firmly democratic until 20-25 years ago, and that has shifted. Now white-collar workers vote Democrat, blue-collar workers vote majoritarian, right? It's not black and white. Vote for Republicans.
Hello, my name is Catalina. I'm from Moldova, but I study in Romania. So I'm also a student, I would like to ask you a little bit to clarify your position on the NATO and the fact that you said that it is possible, but many states will now invest more in the military and the security area. And you said this like, not like, but I presume that you said this like it's something bad, but it's something not so good. And I would like to know your perspective on this, and I would like to, just to clarify, do you agree with the scholars that say that the Cold War stopped or ended when the USSR ended, or do you agree with the fact that NATO was dead at that time? Because I think it's a little bit, it's not literally correct. I think in my perspective the Cold War did not end. It is still now ongoing. This is why NATO is
a new Cold War, right?
Yes, this is why NATO is still needed, especially now, and this is why many European countries started to think about the security, the military areas, because they are flawed now, they are not effective, and with war in Ukraine, it's important also to think about the national security.
Yeah. No, I mean, I hope it didn't, thank you. Good question. I hope it didn't come across, well, I'm personally, I have my doubts about NATO, but this is mostly, my personal doubts are related to the fact that NATO may contribute actually to a new Cold War, okay? But in general, I do think it is necessary and is important that the Europeans are increasing their defense budgets, okay? I think that is, particularly as a German, I mean, even if you see now how Anna Baerbock, the German foreign minister, right, drives a fairly idealistic stance on Ukraine as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, that German idealism era is way over, okay? And you've seen the German government, adding in the Zeitenwende, 100 billion euros, right? That may or may not be actually, implemented, given the economic woes of Germany right now. So in that sense, I do think it is very important that the Europeans are contributing more, right, for their own defense, because in this unsafe age, you need to project, particularly when you have a war in Ukraine, right, and you don't know how far Putin will go. We simply do not know. There were some analysts that suggested that now that Trump is in power, he may try to, and Trump is not NATO-friendly, he may try to test NATO by maybe trying to invade the Baltics. I mean, this is stuff that is being published, okay, in terms of political analysis. And I wouldn't, I don't know about you, but I thought, well, that's kind of crazy. You wouldn't attack a NATO country, another NATO country. But we also thought the same about Ukraine in 2022. So it is definitely important. But as you know, with most European economies not doing so well, particularly in the West, right? Of course, you have more veto players, and it's more difficult to invest big sums that are needed into defense production and procurement. The EU even has now the Commissioner for Defense, right? But he's supposed to build up that common defense procurement and defense market as a way to kind of also shore up Europe's economy. So I think it's more of sort of political problem in many capitals, but now they will have to, they may get that bit of medicine, and they will go way beyond what many Central Eastern European countries already do, right? Go beyond the 2% or 3% or more. Hey. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, hello. My name is Samia. I'm a Canadian student.
Oh.
From University Laval. Bonjour. So my question was more so linked with the USMCA, since it has been renegotiated under Trump's administration when it used to be NAFTA. And there's a clause that said that it's going to be reviewed every 6 years, which falls into 2026.
Interesting.
Yeah, so what are your predictions on the outcome of this revision, and on both transatlantic and trans-Pacific relations for both Canada, US, and also Mexico?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have to be very honest, and again, since I'm not an economist, right, I don't know all that much about the USMCA, right, except that it replaces basically what you know, right? I'm not gonna trying to tell you therefore too much about sort of what I do think will happen, right? But given that he came up with it, and I don't, again, it seemed like it wasn't worse than NAFTA, because many Americans did complain about that outsourcing of jobs that happened with NAFTA, right? And not necessarily to Canada, but particularly to Mexico. You know this. Probably you have the same kind of discussions in Canada about the outsourcing to Mexico, the same problems, exactly. So the USMCA, I think, may have been a little more just in that regard. Now, what we see, however, is that the EU has, remember, that EU-Canada agreement that came after Trump came into office, right? The EU-Mexico free trade agreement has been bumped up when Trump came in office, right? So again, the EU also, the Commission is now trying to, EU-Mercosur, they're trying to basically work around the US market, finding alternative partners, particularly economically, wherever they can, right? That's the best prediction I can kind of do. But again, I left my crystal home, obvious at home, because I didn't expect that last night either. Yes, there was, yeah.
Okay.
What time is it? I don't know.
Yes.
One, yeah.
Yeah, just one.
Hello, thank you for being here.
Oh, yes.
I'm Mariana, I'm an Italian student. I will ask about like the hot topic or issue of nowadays, that is the Israeli and Palestinian conflict.
Saving the best for last.
Yes. So I read this morning that like the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Netanyahu actually congratulated to Trump for winning the elections, and basically defined the relationship as a true friendship. And I also remember that in 2019, like a new settlement, Israeli new settlement was made after the President Trump.
Right.
Trump hates something like that.
Trump hates, yeah.
So probably this means that Trump is going to engage in a more hardline stances towards the Middle East, and this will have an impact also probably on the relationship with Iran, and yeah, really bring to a more an escalation of the conflict, and also like throwing Israel and Iran into a larger and probably regional conflict, question mark.
Yeah, so, I mean, according to him, right, I mean, you're right in that, according to him, he will make peace, right, and again, the famous 24 hours. I don't think, unlike Ukraine, right, because Ukraine is much more dependent on the US and Europe in terms of supplies of weapons, military and support, I don't think he can really dictate a settlement of the conflict to Iran. In that sense, there is more of the risk of escalation, okay? But on the other hand, given that now Netanyahu has free rein to do what he wants, and Israel has the predominant military power in the region, okay, I don't think it will necessarily escalate, because if, then we would have seen already an escalation already now in the last couple of days, okay? When, remember, Iran and Israel basically bombed proxies in Lebanon and so on, okay? So I don't think it will necessarily escalate, because now Netanyahu knows anyway, unlike the Biden administration, that he can pretty much do whatever he wants. He can use his power and he will get military aid, he will get the weapons that he wants, right, from the Trump administration. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know about you, but I was worried about, and there was talk about in the last coming days, now these days leading up to the election, that there would be a strategic strike by either Israel and Iran that then would influence and result in a Trump election. Obviously, we've seen that wasn't even necessary, right? Unfortunately.
Okay, so Professor Markus Thiel, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.